Hello everyone and welcome. In this video I'm going to talk about operations in C++. So I'm going to teach you how to add, subtract, divide, multiply, increment, decrement, and even get the remainder of a division in C++. And I'm also going to talk about some nuances and some stuff that you have to keep in mind when performing arithmetic operations in C++, namely the data types of the operands and stuff like that. So let's get into it. First of all, I'm going to talk about the easiest, which are going to be the addition and subtraction operators. So I'm going to create two variables, num1, which is going to be an integer 10, and num2, which is going to be the integer 20. So I can actually add these two numbers together and store that value in a variable which I'm going to call num. It is also going to be an integer and it's going to be equal to num1 plus num2. So let's see out num to see the output that we get. So if I run this code, you can see that this is going to output 30. So there you go. Now, of course, you don't have to do this. You can just print the sum directly. So you can say cout num1 plus num2. And if you run this, this is also going to output 30. So it's going to be exactly the same. So now let's talk about the data types of the operands. So you can see that in this case, both of the operands are going to be integers, and the result is also going to be integer. So what if I change these to floats? So let me say float num1 and float num2. Let's add a decimal point, which is going to be 0.4. And I'm not going to add a decimal point to num2, but you can actually convert integers to floats easily in C++. So this is going to be a float. So although I stored 20, which is supposedly an integer in num2, it's going to be a float represented by 20.0. Okay, so this is going to be a float. And then the result is going to be an integer. So this is obviously going to be 30.4, right? The sum of these numbers is going to be 30.4. But now if I run this, you can see that this still outputs 30. Why is that? Because the operands are floats, right? So the output should be 30.4, which is also a float. But I actually defined the resulting number to be an integer. And so what's going to happen when I output this number is it's just going to cut off the decimal point of that sum. Now, if I actually change this to a float, and I run this code, you can see that it now has the decimal point, so it's going to output 30.4. So that's how these data types work. And if I change one of these to an integer, for example, this first number, this is also going to cut off the decimal point, and so the result is just going to be 10 plus 20. So if I run this, you can see that this is going to print 30. So that's how this works. Now, you can also use addition with strings. You can say string name equals Mike, and then string last name equals Morgan, for example, like so. And you can actually add these strings together. Now, don't forget to include string in your program if you're going to try this, because if you don't, you're going to get an error. So if you say string full name equals name plus last name, and you cout this, so let me say cout full name, and if I run this code, you can see that this is going to print Mike Morgan. So this is actually kind of mushed together. So let me add a space in here. Let me say string, let me put an empty string right here. And so I'm going to add the first name, which is going to be Mike, and then an empty string. So there's going to be a space between the words. And then I'm going to add the last name, and I'm going to cout that full name. So if I run this, this is going to print Mike Morgan. So as you can see, addition also works for strings. So that's the basics of how addition works. Now let me talk about subtraction. So of course, subtraction is only going to work for numbers. It's not going to work for strings because it doesn't really make sense to subtract strings, right? So if I say int num1 equals 20, int num2 equals 30, and then int num equals num1 minus num2, and let me cout num. So if I run this code, you can see that this is going to print minus 10. So this is going to print 20 minus 30. Now, although this is a negative number, there's no issue because negative numbers are supported by C++. Of course, if I change this, so num2 minus num1, this is going to output just the integer 10. So the same thing happens with the data types. If I say this is a float, and if I say this is a float, but the result is an integer, then instead of printing the exact subtraction, which would have a floating point, it's just going to print the integer. So it's going to cut off the decimal point. Now, if I say that this is a float, then it's going to have that decimal point. So it's going to print 10.5, which is the exact subtraction of these numbers. Now, if I change num1 to an integer, then it's going to cut off this 0.3 and it's just going to subtract 30.8. Sorry, it's just going to subtract 20 from 30.8. And so if I run this, it's going to print 10.8. So there you go, that's how subtraction works. Now let's get into stuff that are a little bit more complicated, but still pretty straightforward. Let's start with the multiplication maybe. So let me say int num equals num1, and then I want to multiply this number by num2. To do that, I'm going to write an asterisk like that. So I'm going to multiply these numbers together. Let me change this into an int, and okay, let's just leave it at that. So keep in mind that these numbers are actually going to be 20 and 30, because since these are integers, the floating point is going to be cut off, and so this is going to multiply 20 by 30. And so let me see out num. And you can see that the result of this is going to be 600. So 20 times 30. And the same happens if I change the data types. If I change all of these to floats, then this is going to print a float as well. So that's how these multiplication works. I can also divide these numbers. So if I divide these numbers and I store the result as a float, this is going to give me a number with floating points. If I say that this is an integer, then this is going to print the whole division. So it's going to print 0 with no floating point. It's just going to cut off the floating point. This is basically the same for all the operations. When you store the result as integers and the operands are floats, it's just going to cut off the decimal point. So that's how that works for all of the operations. Now, of course, you can do multiple operations at once. So if I say cout 2 times 4 divided by 3 plus 0.7, and I run this, this is just going to perform this operation and produce the output, which is going to be 2.7. And the order of these operations is just going to be the order of normal mathematical operations. So everything that's in between parentheses is going to be executed first. So if I put this in between parentheses, this is going to add 3 and 0.7 first, and then it's going to perform the rest of the operations. And then multiplication and division are performed first. So if I had like plus 8 here, 2 and 4 would be multiplied first and then divided by this number. And then in the end, I would add 8. So that's how this works. If I print this, this is just going to print the result. So it's going to work as well. Now, I talked about incrementing and decrementing as well. So if I say int num equals 1, and I say num equals num plus 2, and I cout num, so cout num, like so, what do you think is going to happen? So if I run this, this is going to output 3. So why does this happen? So first of all, I initialized num to be 1, and then I set num equal to num plus 2. So num is now going to be equal to 1, which is stored inside of num at the time of this operation, plus 2. So num is going to equal 3. And so when I see out num, it's going to output 3. Now there is a short way to do this. Instead of writing num equals num plus 2, I can just write num plus equals 2. So this is just going to add 2 to the number stored in num. So it's going to output 3 as well. And you can also do this with subtraction. So this is going to subtract 2 from num and then output the result. And you can also do this with multiplication. And you can also do this with division. So as you can see, everything is working correctly. We're getting the expected results. So notice that in the division case, it actually printed 0 because since this is an integer, the result, although it's going to have a decimal point, right, it's going to be 0.5 because 1/2 is 0.5. Since this is an integer, num is actually going to be 0 because the floating point is going to be cut off. But if I change this into a float and I output this, this is going to give me 0.5. Now, with these methods, you can update num to have any value that you want. But if you want to specifically add or subtract 1 from num, you can actually use a short way to do that, which is going to be num plus plus. And this is what's called incrementing. So we're going to increment num by 1 using this shortcut. So this is just going to print 2, which is 1 plus 1. And you can also decrement, which is going to be minus minus. So if you run this, this is going to give me 0 because 1 minus 1 is going to be 0. So that's how increment and decrement works. And I also said that you can get the remainder of a division. So you can do that by using the modulus operator. So let me create another variable, which is going to be num2. This is going to equal 7. And let me name this num1 instead of num. And then I want to see out num2 modulus, which is going to be the percent sign num1. So this is going to output the remainder of the division of num1 by num2. Now, if I run this, this is actually going to output 0 because 7 divided by 1 is 7 with no remainder. But if I change this to be num1 divided by, not num7, num2, and I run this, this is going to give me 1 because 7 doesn't fit any number of times inside of 1. Let's put it that way. So if I say this is 4 and this is 3, then the remainder is going to be 1 because 3 fits inside of 4 one time, and then the remainder is going to be 1. And if I change these operators, these operands, sorry, and I run this, this is going to give me 3. So that's how the modulus works, and that's how you can get the remainder of divisions in C++. So I think that was all I had to show you today. I don't think I'm forgetting anything. If I am, then I'll probably talk about it in later videos, but these are kind of the basics of how operations in C++ works. I hope this was easy to understand. If it wasn't, if you have any doubts, if I explained something wrong, please write it in the comments and I'll try to help you out. And with that said, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.